One summer evening in 1867, an 11-year-old girl went out for a walk in the small English town of New Romney, but she never returned. Just a few hours later, her body was discovered in a ditch. Unfortunately, the police wouldn't have to search long for the killer because the girl's family knew exactly who had done this to her. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime cults and heinous history. And today we're going back to the Victorian era to talk about the case of Frances Kidder. Frances Kidder was the very definition of a wicked stepmother. For years, she tortured her young stepdaughter, and then one day she did the unthinkable. But before we get into the story, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by HelloFresh. I've been on a bit of a health journey recently, and part of that journey involves eating less takeout. It's so easy to order takeout nowadays, with just a click of a button, you can have pretty much whatever you want within minutes. It's too easy to slip into a cycle of eating greasy, unhealthy food. And so I've made some changes to help keep me on track, and that is where HelloFresh comes in. HelloFresh is a meal service with tons of recipes to choose from, and what I absolutely love about HelloFresh is that they provide every single ingredient that you need for the recipes. Most of us do not like grocery shopping. I know that I don't. Whether it's online or in person, it's just not fun. You have to figure out your menu for the week, then you have to go through and add every single ingredient one by one to your cart. I typically forget something, but with HelloFresh, you just look at their list of available meals that week, you add them to your box, and that's it. This is one of my HelloFresh boxes laid out so that you can see just how simple they make it. Every ingredient I need to prepare this week's meals is right here along with each individual recipe card. It's so incredibly convenient, especially on those extra hectic days when you come home and you can't decide what you're going to cook for dinner. My husband and I are constantly busing kids here and there all week long, and it's easy for the day to just slip away from us. Before we know it, it's dinner time. We're just kind of staring at each other trying to figure out what we're going to have for dinner. And this is when HelloFresh comes in to save the day because they make it so easy to get a delicious meal together in no time. This week I chose the Chipotle honey chicken and jasmine rice, the soy glazed steak and zucchini stir fry, and the cheddar crusted crispy chicken with mashed potatoes and broccoli. And my favorite this week was definitely the soy glazed steak with zucchini stir fry. This was so easy to prepare and it was absolutely delicious. This one included jasmine rice with scallion ginger sauce, and that sauce was so good. I'll definitely be adding this meal again in the future. And HelloFresh has now doubled their menu size. They're offering more than 100 recipes each week, and they've doubled the amount of healthy options with at least 15 high protein recipes every single week. They also now have bigger portion sizes, which is perfect for a large family. And right now you can get up to 10 free meals on your first box at HelloFresh.com when you use code SUMMERFM. Free meals are applied as a discount on your first box, new subscribers only, and it varies by plan. That's up to 10 free HelloFresh meals plus free shipping. Just go to HelloFresh.com and use code SUMMERFM. Or you can click my link in the description box below. Thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. It's the night of August 25th, 1867, and 40-year-old William Henry Kidder has just arrived at his in-laws' home in the small market town of New Romney, Kent, in England. His wife Frances had gone to stay with her parents for a few weeks, and she had taken their 2 children with her, and so William had come to pick them up to take them back to their family home in Hythe. But as soon as William arrives at his in-laws' home, he's given some very distressing news. His 11-year-old daughter, Louisa, is missing. She's just disappeared. His wife, Frances, had taken Louisa out for a walk at around 8 o'clock that evening, and when Frances returned 2 hours later, Louisa was not with her, and Frances's clothes were muddy and soaking wet. When her mother asked, what happened? Where is Louisa? She wouldn't really give a response. She just kept pointing out towards the road and saying there, but she wouldn't really specify where there was. She was being extremely vague about Louisa's whereabouts. And so William, he's hearing all of this information and he's immediately very concerned, and he knows that something terrible has happened to his daughter. He knows how much his wife hates Louisa, and she has spent the last 2 years absolutely terrorizing this child. And William knows that if Frances was the last person with Louisa before she disappeared, this was probably going to end in tragedy. So let's go back a few years to 1864. William was living on Theatre Street in Hythe, which is a seaside town in Kent, and he was working as a greengrocer, so he sold fruits and vegetables and stuff. And William was a single dad to 2 young girls. He had an 8-year-old daughter named Louisa, and he had a 2-year-old named Ellen. His long-term partner, Eliza Staples, had passed away not long after the birth of their second child. They never got married, but they were considered common law husband and wife because they had been together for so long. And after Eliza's death, the baby Ellen was sent to live with her parents. I guess, since she was so young, William needed help taking care of her. And so the baby was sent to live with Eliza's parents, which probably ended up saving her life in the end, because not long after Eliza's death, William met a woman named Frances Turner, and she was not a good person, and that is putting it lightly. Frances Turner was born in 1843 in New Romney, and we don't know much else about her childhood. There's potential that she was abused as a child, that there was some neglect there, but all we know for sure was that she came from a very large family. She had a ton of siblings. When Frances was 18, she went to the nearby town of Folkestone to work for a family as a domestic servant, and it was during her time working in Folkestone that she met William Kidder. Now, we don't really know the nature of their relationship. It could have just been a one-night stand situation. That's what it seems like, but we don't know for sure. But whatever the case, not long after they met, Frances ended up pregnant, and there was no doubt that William was the father. And Frances really wanted William to marry her, so that they could have this baby together, they could become a family, but he had absolutely no interest in that. He wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. And so at this point in the story, you can feel kind of sorry for Frances. She's living in a different town away from her family. She's not making much money. Now she's pregnant, and the guy who got her pregnant, who was 15 years older than her, by the way, doesn't want anything to do with her. And there was a social stigma when it came to unwed mothers. They were looked down on. They were viewed as like used goods. And so yeah, at this point in the story, I did feel sorry for Frances. She goes through the pregnancy alone, she gives birth alone, and she has a little girl that she named Emma. And it was sometime right after she gave birth to Emma that William and Frances do actually end up getting married. You can see their marriage announcement right here in this newspaper article. But this seemed to be a marriage of convenience and not a marriage of love, at least on William's part. It's thought that Frances might have threatened to go to the magistrate to see about getting financial support from William for the baby, but instead of going through all of that, he just gave in and agreed to marry her. What a great guy. And this relationship was doomed from the start. First of all, after they got married, Frances quit her job as a domestic servant, she packed her bags, and she moved to William's house on Theater Street in Hythe. And when she arrived at William's home, she was absolutely shocked to find out that he had 2 children, Louisa and Ellen. Apparently, William had failed to mention that he had kids. Frances had no idea that she was now a stepmother. And this is why it's thought that their relationship was more of just like a fling or a one-night stand, because they knew virtually nothing about one another before they got married. Frances was not thrilled about being a stepmother. She wanted nothing to do with William's other 2 children. She wanted it to just be her and William and their newborn daughter Emma, and these other 2 kids were ruining her dreams. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Ellen, the youngest of William's children with his first partner Eliza, she had been sent to live with her grandparents, and so she's not living there in the home. But his 8-year-old daughter Louisa was not so lucky. She was still living in her father's home, and her life changed in the worst way imaginable the day that her stepmother walked through the front door. Frances treated Louisa horribly. She viewed her as nothing but a burden, and she showed her no love, no affection, which is really sad because love and affection is exactly what Louisa needed at that point in her life. Her own mother had died when she was only 6 years old. Her baby sister is gone now. She's living with her grandparents, and her father works all day. And so Louisa would have needed someone in her life that would show her some compassion, but instead she got the exact opposite from Frances. Now, despite her unfortunate situation, Louisa was described as a happy-go-lucky kid. She was very friendly. She was always talking to the neighbors. She was just like an overall good kid. But after Frances moved in, friends and family noticed a dramatic shift in her demeanor. She became withdrawn. She didn't smile as much. There was now this noticeable sadness about Louisa. And that's because Frances was terrorizing her day in and day out. It turns out that Frances had a very, very bad temper, and she was known to just fly into fits of rage for the smallest things. And she directed a lot of that rage towards this innocent, defenseless 8-year-old child. While William was working during the day, Louisa would be left alone with Frances, and this is when a lot of the abuse took place. Frances would brutally beat Louisa on a regular basis. Sometimes she would beat her with household objects. She would beat her with a broomstick until she was black and blue. The beatings were so violent and frenzied. Frances didn't care where she hit her. She didn't care that her injuries were going to be visible to other people. There were times when she would hit Louisa in the face and cause her to bleed, and neighbors would see Louisa with black eyes and bloodstains all over her clothes. And Frances would never dress Louisa properly. She was always seen wearing old, worn out clothes and shoes. And the abuse just continued to escalate as time went on. Eventually, Frances started forcing Louisa to sleep down in the cellar. And she would force her to sleep in a corner of the cellar on old, empty potato sacks. And sometimes she would even just lock her out of the house and she would have to sleep outside. She was also starving Louisa. She would feed her very little food. And when she did give her food, it was usually bread and butter. So Louisa started losing weight, and the neighbors could see that she was losing weight. People could see that something was seriously wrong. They could hear Louisa screaming from inside the house. They could see the marks on her body, the blood on her clothes. And soon whispers started swirling around the neighborhood about the way Louisa was being treated. They could see that this child, who had been really outgoing and happy, was now completely beaten down. And Frances was not even ashamed of what she was doing either. She would openly tell people how much she hated Louisa, and she would refer to her as that little bitch. And where was William in all of this? Well, William was not a very good parent either. He was obviously ignoring the fact that his child is in constant danger being left alone with Frances every day. He can see the bruises on Louisa's body. He can see that she's losing weight, and he knows that she's being forced to sleep down in the cellar, but he apparently isn't doing anything about it because nothing ever changed. I didn't find any reports of William actually inflicting any of the abuse on Louisa, but he was at the very least complicit, and that makes him just as guilty. Now, I did read in the research that in 1866, Frances actually took William to court, claiming that he was physically abusing her. And it's odd because literally everything that she said William was doing to her, it's all stuff that she was doing to Louisa. Like, she told the court that he was beating her, that he was starving her, that he was making her sleep outside. And I'm not saying that William didn't do all of those things to Frances, but I do find it strange that everything that she's claiming is identical to what she's done to Louisa. William did end up with a warrant after those claims, but nothing ever happened with that. It just kind of fizzled out, and they remained married. And it wasn't just Frances's immediate family that caught the brunt of her rage. She would also lash out at the neighbors. She was constantly getting into altercations with the neighbors, and it would get so bad that the law would have to get involved. And back then, if you had to visit the magistrate for any reason, it would be reported in the local newspaper. They would report on pretty much anything you can think of: family drama, marital issues, and Frances Kidder pops up a lot in those records because she had so many disputes with the neighbors. About 6 months after Frances moved in with William, one of the neighbors, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Baker, made the mistake of showing Louisa a little bit of kindness. Elizabeth, like the other neighbors, knew that Louisa was being mistreated by Frances, and she felt really sorry for her. And so one day she happened to see Louisa out on the street, and she was looking very sad and thin. And so Elizabeth gave Louisa some food. That's all she did. And that was enough to send Frances into a rage. Frances came outside. She saw that Elizabeth had given food to Louisa, and she completely lost it. And she started screaming at Elizabeth. And she actually ended up physically assaulting this little old lady, all because she gave Louisa some food. Elizabeth ended up reporting that to the magistrate, and Frances was ordered to pay her 15 shillings as punishment. There was another time when Frances climbed on top of her neighbor's house and poured water down their chimney. Why? I have no idea. She also purposely broke some of her neighbor's windows. The Kidder family was reported on so much that the title of one of the articles in the local newspaper was "The Kidders Again." They were the neighbors from hell. Now, while we're on the topic of old newspaper articles, while I was going through old articles for my research on this case, I found this insane article titled "Dreadful Attack Upon a Child by Rats." And I was horrified. I do want to warn you that this is very disturbing. So according to this article, a mother and father left their 6-month-old baby alone in her crib while they went out to work. At some point, the older brother came home, heard the baby screaming bloody murder, and so he ran into the baby's room and found a bunch of massive rats literally attempting to eat this baby alive. It's like nightmare fuel. Pause to read the full article if you want, but I come across really crazy articles while I'm researching these old cases, but this has to be the worst one yet. Now back to the story. So in May of 1866, one of the neighbors named William Henniker reported to the magistrate that Frances had destroyed some of his property. Typically, we don't know why Frances does the things that she does, but this time we actually do have a potential motive for why she destroyed William Henniker's property. A year earlier, William Henniker decided that it was time that he reported what was happening to Louisa. Finally, someone was going to speak up about the torture of this child. William had tried to help Louisa in the past. He had taken her into his home on occasion when Frances would lock her outside, and he just couldn't stand to watch the abuse go on any longer. And so he ended up going to the magistrate and he told them about everything. And they actually did do something about it. They had Louisa removed from the home and she was sent to live with her grandparents and her little sister Ellen in a nearby town. And William and Frances were ordered to send a weekly payment to the grandparents to help out with Louisa's care. So now Louisa is safe. She is in another town far away from her evil stepmother and father. And I really wish that this is where the story ended, but unfortunately, this was not the end of Louisa's nightmare because William did not keep up with the payments to the grandparents. And because of this, unbelievably, they sent Louisa back to Hythe, back to the place where she had been tortured every single day. The grandparents probably had no money. You know, they had 6 young kids of their own that they were still raising. Money was extremely tight. But how could they have made the decision to send her back to that house knowing that she was in danger? And this sadly sealed Louisa's fate. As soon as she was back, Frances picked right back up where she left off. The beating started again. She started restricting her food. She was forcing her to sleep in the cold, dark cellar. And life just goes on like this until the summer of 1867. At this point, Louisa is 11 years old, and Frances has been terrorizing her stepdaughter and really all of Theater Street for about 2.5 years. And then one day, Frances and William were riding on a carriage, and Frances somehow fell off the carriage and injured herself pretty badly. She got a pretty bad head injury. She went home to recover for a bit, but then she later decided to go finish her recovery at her parents' house back in New Romney. So she packs up the 2 kids, Louisa and her own 2-year-old daughter Emma, and she makes the 10-mile journey to her parents' home in New Romney while William stays back in Hythe. And this is when Frances makes a promise to herself that no matter what she has to do, when it's finally time to return home to Hythe, Louisa will not be going back with her. We don't know much about the days leading up to the tragic events that are about to unfold, but we do know that Frances was pretty open about wanting Louisa out of the picture. She had made some very disturbing comments to a woman named Eliza Evans the day before Louisa disappeared. Eliza was one of her parents' neighbors, and she and Frances had met up that day to have some tea and catch up. And as they were sipping their tea, Frances said, "I wish to get rid of the child before I go home. I hate the very sight of her. There will be no peace all the time that she is alive." And the next day, Louisa disappeared. It was August 25th, 1867, and that day started out just like any other. Frances's parents asked if she wanted to go out for a walk that evening, but she said no. She said she had a headache and she planned to just stay in. So her parents leave for their walk, and Frances is left at the house with 2 of her younger siblings and Emma and Louisa. Now, Frances knew that William would be there any day now to pick her and the kids up to head back home, and so if she was going to get rid of Louisa, she needed to do it soon. And so she set a plan into motion. She sent her 2 siblings out of the house with Emma, and then she invited Louisa to go for a walk. And this is the last time that anyone would ever see Louisa alive. By the time her parents returned home from their walk, Frances and Louisa were gone, which they thought was strange because Frances said that she was going to stay in that night. Then at around 10 p.m., Frances suddenly walks in. She is soaking wet and she's all alone. Louisa is not with her. So her mother asked her about Louisa. She's asking where she is, and Frances isn't really saying anything. She just points towards the road and said she's there. William is there at this point, and he starts asking Frances what's going on, but she's not telling him anything either. But William, like I said earlier, he knows that this is not going to end well because he's well aware of how Frances feels about Louisa. Why he would have ever let Frances take Louisa with her to her parents' home, knowing about the abuse. It doesn't seem like William William cares all that much about Louisa. So with Francis not giving them any meaningful information, William decided to send for the police. And I think this is very telling, but Francis's own parents and siblings immediately suspected that she had killed Louisa. So the police arrive and they immediately start questioning Francis because they know that she's the last person to see Louisa, and she did finally start talking. She said that she and Louisa had went out for a walk at around 8 o'clock that night, and as they were walking across Cobb's Bridge, two horses ran towards them. They got startled and Louisa fell into a ditch. She said that there was water in the ditch, and so she tried to go in after Louisa, which would explain her wet dress, but she could not reach her. Now, the police were not buying this story, mainly because the ditch that she was talking about would have only had maybe a foot of water in it, and an 11-year-old child could have easily gotten out of that ditch with no trouble. In fact, the police said that a child as young as 4 years old could have escaped that ditch with little to no issue. So Francis is placed under arrest for suspicion of harming Louisa. Meanwhile, the police are out searching around the area, and they go to Cobb's Bridge because that's the only specific place that Francis had mentioned in her story. And there she was. The body of 11-year-old Louisa Kidder Staples was lying face up in the ditch. The officer leading the investigation was named P.C. Aspinall, and this is what he said about the discovery of the body. It was a clear starlit night, and we were furnished with lamps. There was a very heavy dew on the grass. Someone noticed something white in the ditch. I threw my light in that direction. It was the body. She was lying on her back and her head was under the water. An inquest was held the next day, and this would determine whether or not this was a homicide, and if it was there enough evidence to indict Francis in the murder? The neighbor, Eliza Evans, the one that Francis had tea with the day before the murder, she testified, and she talked all about the disturbing comments that Francis had made to her that day. When she said, "I wish to get rid of the child before I go home. I hate the very sight of her. There will be no peace all the time that she is alive." Then a 15-year-old girl named Jane Smith testified that she had spoken to Louisa the morning of her death. Louisa had shown her scratches on her neck, and she told Jane that her mother Francis had tried to strangle her the night before. Louisa also allegedly told Jane that Francis admitted to her that she did not want her to live long enough to return home to Hythe. There was also a family friend named Isaac Sage that testified. He told the court about seeing Louisa always covered in bruises over the years. He said when she was younger, she was a nice-spirited little thing, but for the last 2 or 3 years, she has grown quite dull, as if losing her senses. I attributed this to the ill usage she has received. And when Isaac was asked if he was shocked to hear about Louisa's death, he said, "No, not at all. I had been expecting it for a long time. I thought it would end like this." It also came out that the investigators found signs of a pretty serious struggle near the ditch where the body was found. And even though all of this evidence was technically circumstantial, it was ruled that Louisa had died of willful murder, and there was enough evidence to suggest that Francis was responsible. The case went to trial, and Francis stuck to her story about those two horses and Louisa falling into the ditch. She told the court that she never hurt Louisa, she loved Louisa, and she never wanted her dead. She said, "This child had been with me for 2 years, and I did my best for her, keeping her clean and sending her to school every day. I could not do for her as I would because I had not the means to do it with. He would not let me have a farthing of money. I never did anyone any harm or wished to them any harm. I have endeavored to do my best for everyone," which we know is not true because it's in those records. All of those times that Francis had assaulted her neighbors or vandalized their property, and how Louisa had literally been taken from their home and sent to live with her grandparents because of the abuse. It took the jury only 12 minutes to return with a verdict of guilty, and Frances Kidder was sentenced to death. Now, while she was in prison awaiting execution, William was apparently busy hooking up with her 18-year-old sister. Yeah, apparently the sister came to live with him to help take care of the 2-year-old, and they started a relationship. She's 18 and he was 41 years old. William was actually getting a lot of heat from the public for his failure to do literally anything to save his daughter from Frances. There were a lot of people who wanted to see him punished as well, which unfortunately never happened, but a big angry mob of like 400 people did march down Theater Street to his house, and they burned an effigy on his lawn and threw stones at his house. Everyone hated him now, so I guess that's something. I did find a letter that William wrote to Frances while she was awaiting execution. I'm not going to read it because it's kind of long, but I'll put it on the screen. It's kind of a mushy, loving letter, but I don't know, it seems kind of phony to me, especially knowing what we know about their relationship and the fact that he is literally sleeping with her younger sister. I think he wrote this letter to make himself seem innocent and forgiving. He knew that the public would end up seeing this letter. He knew it would end up in the newspaper. And so maybe he thought that it would sway public opinion a bit. I don't know. And while she was awaiting execution, Frances did finally confess that she had murdered Louisa, but she said that it was not something she had planned. It was a spur of the moment thing, and she had drowned Louisa in the ditch that night. Some people believe that the head injury from that fall off the carriage could have pushed Frances over the edge. Maybe there was some brain damage there. Unfortunately, we'll never know. But on April 2nd, 1868, Frances Kidder was sent to the gallows at Maidstone Prison in front of a crowd of about 4,000 people. She was set to be executed by William Calcraft, who honestly seems like a monster himself. He was a hangman for 45 years, and he performed over 450 public executions, and his method of choice was very cruel. He chose the short drop method.
Calcraft's technique was controversial. Unlike the more humane long drop method, which broke the neck instantly, Calcraft often used the horrific short drop method, which resulted in the condemned slowly strangling to death. He hardly ever altered the rope's length to take account for the person's weight, and on numerous occasions he would disappear below the scaffold to hang on the person's legs to finish the job.
Calcraft would sometimes pull on their legs, or sometimes he would climb up onto their shoulders as they were slowly dying. And it's thought that these hangings were purposely botched in order to entertain the large crowds of people at these public executions. And Frances Kidder was one of the unlucky ones who did take a while to die. She was only 25 years old when she was executed. She has gone down in history as the last woman to ever be publicly executed in England. And that is all I have on this case. Let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to check the description box for the link to try out HelloFresh. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.